The chamber had gone silent before Ambassador Yara Chen laughed. That was what Delegate Voskerath would remember later. Not the vote, not the proclamation, not the 1,700 assembled voices of the Galactic Senate rising in unified condemnation. What Voskerath would remember, replaying the memory in the particular way that minds return to things they cannot explain, was the silence that preceded it. The way every sound in the conclave hall seemed to be pulled inward at once, like the room itself was inhaling. And then the human made a sound that had no translation in any of the 43 recognized languages of the interstellar compact. She laughed. Not a performance, not defiance staged for cameras. It was quiet, almost private, the sound of someone who has just been told the punchline of a joke they already knew. Voskerath had been studying humans for 11 years. That laugh was the moment the study became something else entirely. The vote had passed 1,412 to 289. Formal designation, Galactic Senate Resolution 7 Omega, Extinction Protocol, applied in the entire recorded history of the compact exactly twice before, once to a species that had rendered 3 star systems biologically uninhabitable, and once to a species that had deliberately collapsed a sun. The resolution carried the weight of finality. It was not a declaration of war. War implied uncertainty. Resolution 7 Omega was a consensus of certainty. This species, the Senate had determined, could not be permitted to continue. The humans had been aware the vote was coming for 31 days. 31 days, and in that time, they had sent exactly one response to the compact's formal notification. Not a defense, not a legal challenge, not a petition for emergency review, which was their right under Article 14 of the Compact Charter. Instead, the human government had transmitted a single document, 4 pages long, in 7 languages. The first 6 pages of translation had been distributed to Senate delegates before the vote. The 7th language was one the Compact's translation engines had never encountered. The document was titled, simply, "A Accounting of What You Will Find." No one had understood what that meant. The mistranslation was assumed. By the time translators flagged the peculiarity of the phrasing, not asterisk and asterisk accounting, but a asterisk accounting, as though the indefinite article was being used intentionally as a kind of qualifier, the vote had already begun. The first mystery was the document. The second was the laugh. The third, the one that would keep Voskerath awake for the next 40 nights, was what the human ambassador had done in the 11 seconds between the vote being announced and the laugh escaping her lips. She had looked down at her hands. Not at the Senate, not at the cameras, not at the ceremonial display showing the final vote tally. She had looked at her own hands quietly as if checking something, confirming something, and then she had laughed. Voskerath had been assigned to human observation because, among all the analysts in the Compact's Xenological Intelligence Division, Voskerath had the highest tolerance for contradiction. It was not a compliment. The division's director, Archanalyst Fenaros, had explained it clinically during the assignment briefing. You have a documented ability to hold 2 mutually exclusive conclusions simultaneously without defaulting to resolution. For most species, this is a cognitive deficit. For studying humans, it appears to be a prerequisite. 11 years later, Voskerath understood what Fenaros had meant, and also understood that Fenaros had vastly underestimated the requirement. The humans were not contradictory in the way that poorly translated cultures sometimes appeared contradictory. They were contradictory in a way that persisted through perfect information. The more data the division acquired, the more coherent the contradictions became, which was a sentence that should not have been possible to construct, and yet was the most precise description of 11 years of research that Voskerath could produce. Take the vote itself. The humans had known it was coming. They had the legal means to delay it. They had not used them. That was the first layer. The second layer, The human government had, in those 31 days, done something with their military assets that no one in the compact's intelligence apparatus had been able to fully account for. Ships had moved, not toward compact space, not into defensive formation around human colonies. Somewhere else, in a pattern that the compact's most sophisticated predictive models classified, repeatedly, and here Voskareth had read the report 3 times to confirm, logistically purposeless. The models had been wrong before, about humans specifically. Voskareth had documented 14 distinct incidents in 11 years where compact strategic models had classified human behavior as purposeless, and in 12 of those 14 cases, the behavior had later revealed a purpose so specific and so patient that the interval between the action and the revealed intent had itself seemed deliberate. The humans, Voskareth had written in a private addendum to the official record, do not appear to make meaningless moves. They appear to make moves whose meaning arrives on a schedule they have already determined. The addendum had been flagged as speculative and removed from the official record. Looking at Yara Chen's face in the moment after the laugh, the way the expression settled into something that was not relief and not fear, but something older than both, Voskareth thought about that addendum. The formal dissolution protocol began 6 hours after the vote. By compact law, Resolution 7 Omega required a 30 standard day grace period before enforcement action could begin, provided the condemned species made no hostile moves during that interval. It was, Voskareth had always thought, a peculiar mercy built into a merciless mechanism, a month to exist, knowing what came next. The human ambassador had, in that 30-day window, requested exactly one meeting. Not with the Senate leadership, not with the Compact's Military Coordination Council. She had requested a meeting with the Xenological Intelligence Division. Specifically, she had requested Voskareth by name. The request had required 4 days to approve. Division protocol required security assessment, psychological profiling of the human diplomat, environmental safety review of the meeting space. Voskareth had spent those 4 days reading the translated 6 pages of *A accounting of what you will find again. The document was not a defense. It was not a plea. It was, as far as Voskareth could determine, a list of things the Compact would discover after the Extinction Protocol was complete. Specific things: infrastructure, data repositories, biological caches. The language was precise and practical in a way that suggested someone who had written lists under pressure before and understood that precision in those moments was a kindness to the reader. Item 7 read: the repository at Kessel Station contains recordings you will want. You will not understand why you want them until you have seen them. Item 12 read: the inoculation protocols for Vendari plague, strain 7 and strain 9. These exist nowhere else. You will need them within 40 years. Item 17 read: we know you will not believe this list is real. We wrote it anyway. Why would they do that? The division's junior analyst, Mara Solik, had asked when Voskareth had shared the document. Write a list of gifts for the species killing them. I don't know, Voskareth had said. And then, because it was the most honest analysis available, that's why it concerns me. Yara Chen arrived at the meeting with no security detail. This alone violated 7 compact protocols for diplomatic interaction with a species under Resolution 7 Omega. The oversight was flagged, escalated, and ultimately waived in the interest of expediency. The grace period was burning, and Archanalyst Fenaros had made the calculation that the risk of one unarmed human diplomat in a secured facility was manageable. Voskareth met her in room 14C, a standard xenological interview space, walls the neutral gray of a species that had decided the color of rooms should not influence the color of conversations. Chen sat down and looked around the room with the focused curiosity of someone cataloging details that might be useful later. She was small by human standards. Voskareth knew. The division had physical records, medical assessments, the full biometric intake from her initial compact credentialing. She had a scar along her left jawline from an incident the records described as industrial accident, pre-diplomatic career. She was 44 years old by human reckoning, and she looked like someone who had spent a portion of those 44 years making decisions she did not enjoy making. "You've read the document," she said, "not a question." 6 pages of it, Voskareth replied. The 7th language remains untranslated. Something shifted in her expression. "It's not a language," she said. "It's a notation system, mathematical, you'll work it out." "What does it say?" She paused. When she spoke, her voice was careful in the way that voices become careful around important words. "It says how long you have." The silence stretched. "How long we have until what?" Voskareth asked. And Yara Chen did something that Voskareth had not anticipated, had not seen in 11 years of human study, and could not immediately categorize. She looked sorry, not for herself, for Voskareth. "Until you need us," she said. The grace period was 26 days old when the first report came in from the border monitoring stations. It came in at 300 station time, which meant the junior duty officer who received it initially classified it as a sensor anomaly and filed it for morning review. This was a mistake that would later be analyzed extensively, though the analysis would ultimately conclude that the duty officer's error was understandable given that what the sensors had detected was not something the compact had a category for. The report described an absence. Specifically, the monitoring stations along the outer rim of compact-adjacent space had been tracking the movement of human vessels for the past 31 days, since the initial notification of resolution 7 Omega. The tracking had been consistent and confident until day 24, when approximately 30% of the tracked vessels had simply ceased to register. Not destroyed, not engaged in combat, not suffering drive failure, which would have produced a characteristic energy signature. The vessels had moved to a certain point in space, and then, as far as every detection system the compact operated could determine, stopped existing. By morning, when the duty officer's filed anomaly reached senior analysis, the number was 63%. "Where are they?" Finaros asked, standing in front of the tracking display, and the room had no answer. Voskareth stood at the back of the briefing room and thought about what Yara Chen had said 4 days earlier, after the meeting in room 14C had concluded. Voskareth had asked one final question at the door. "Ambassador, did you know, when you came here, that we would vote for extinction?" Chen had paused with one hand on the door frame, and then she'd said something that had not fit in any of Voskareth's analytical frameworks for 11 years of human study. She'd said, "We were counting on it." She'd said it quietly, with the particular tone of someone stating a logistical fact rather than a dramatic one. Then she had walked out, and the door had closed, and Voskareth had stood in room 14C for 6 minutes before moving. "We were counting on it." The fleet was disappearing. The vote had been anticipated. The document was a list of posthumous gifts. And somewhere in the 7th page of asterisk, a accounting of what you will find, written in a notation system that was not a language but a mathematical proof, was a number that the human ambassador had described as how long the compact had. Until it needed them. Every answer, Voskareth understood, standing in that briefing room at 300 while Finaros demanded explanations from people who had none. Every answer was a larger question wearing the answer's clothing. The compact's enforcement fleet launched on day 28. Standard protocol for Resolution 7 Omega called for a comprehensive approach, simultaneous engagement across all known population centers, infrastructure neutralization preceding any direct action, communication blackout enforced from first contact. It was designed to be thorough. It was designed to be, in the compact's careful bureaucratic language, asterisk complete. The fleet was 1,400 vessels, the largest mobilization in compact history that was not a response to external aggression. It took 36 hours to position, during which time Voskareth sat in the monitoring station aboard the command carrier and read, again, Item 17 of the human document. We know you will not believe this list is real. We wrote it anyway. The fleet arrived at the coordinates of the primary human colony world at 600. The colony world was empty. Not destroyed, not evacuated in obvious haste, empty in a way that took 6 hours of surface scanning to confirm because the buildings were still there, the infrastructure was intact, the atmospheric processors were still running on automated cycle. The farms were tended. The water treatment was functional. Every system that a civilization needed to maintain itself was maintaining itself, with no civilization inside it. The livestock were present. Automated agricultural systems were operating. Someone had made arrangements for the continuation of the physical infrastructure before leaving it. Fleet Commander Orethval's voice over the command channel was one that Voskareth had known for 20 years and had never heard carry the precise quality it carried in that moment. Report from surface team, Orethval said. The colony is operational, it is simply unoccupied. Where are the humans? No one had an answer. Voskareth did not offer the thought that was assembling in the analytical part of a mind that had spent 11 years cataloging human behavior, because the thought required confirming before it could be stated, and confirming it would require seeing something that may or may not have been left behind. Commander, Voskareth said, request permission to have a surface team search for documents, written documents. The humans have a history of leaving notes. There was a pause on the channel. You think they left a note, Orethval said. I think, Voskareth said carefully, that they have thought about this moment longer than we have. The note was found in the administrative center of the colony's governing building. It was printed on physical material, paper. The humans called it, made from processed plant fibers. A technology so archaic that the compact's first xenological surveys had cataloged it as evidence of pre-industrial development, before discovering that humans maintained the technology deliberately, alongside more sophisticated alternatives, for reasons that the division's cultural analysis team had spent considerable time debating. The note was 1 page. It was addressed, specifically, to the Xenological Intelligence Division. It was addressed to Voskareth. We left the infrastructure, it read. The automated systems will keep running for approximately 40 years without maintenance. We thought you might want the time. The inoculation protocols are in the medical repository, sublevel 4. The access code is the stardate of first contact between our species, in your calendar notation. We remember that date more precisely than you probably expect us to. We have gone somewhere you will not find us. This is not a threat. It is a fact stated so that you do not spend resources looking, and so that when we return, and we will return, you will understand that our absence was chosen. We have one request. When you open the Kessel Station repository, watch everything before you decide what it means. Humans have a saying about this. Don't read the last page of the book first. The meaning is in the sequence. We are not angry. We understand why you voted the way you voted. You saw something that frightened you, and you did what frightened civilizations do. We have done it ourselves. We are not innocent of that particular fear. But we are asking you to hold your understanding loosely for a while. We are asking you to consider the possibility that what you saw was not what you think you saw. The notation on the 7th page of our document is a proof. It describes a convergence event. If our models are correct, and we have spent 40 years making sure they are correct, the compact will face something in approximately 38 years that it cannot survive without a particular kind of help. We will be there. We were counting on being needed. Ambassador Yara Chen, on behalf of the human species. Voskareth read the letter 3 times on the surface of an empty world that smelled of cut grain and recycled air, surrounded by fleet officers who were waiting for an analysis that could explain what they were looking at. 38 years. The same number from the mathematical proof on the 7th page, which the Compact's translation teams had finally decoded 2 days earlier and which had produced. In the senior analysis chamber, a silence not unlike the one that had preceded Yara Chen's laugh in the Senate hall. The proof described a convergence of 3 separate phenomena: a deteriorating stellar boundary in the outer rim, a biological transmission vector that had been catalogued and dismissed as inactive 17 years ago, and a structural vulnerability in the Compact's communication relay network that no one had identified, because it required seeing all 3 systems simultaneously to perceive the interaction between them. The humans had seen all 3 simultaneously. They had been watching all 3 for 40 years. The proof was not a threat. It was not a demonstration of power. It was a piece of work, careful, patient, extraordinarily specific, produced by a species that had spent 4 decades watching the galaxy the way a certain kind of mind watches a slow-moving disaster, not with dread, but with the focused attention of someone who intends to do something about it when the time comes. They knew, Voskareth said, to no one in particular, and then because the word *new* was not sufficient, they have been preparing for this, not for the extinction vote, for what comes after. They designed the vote to happen, so they could be here unencumbered when it does. The fleet officer standing nearest turned with an expression that mixed professional composure with something rower underneath it. "You're saying they maneuvered the Galactic Senate into condemning them?" "I'm saying," Voskareth replied, "that they counted on us being afraid of them." The silence that followed was different from the one in the Senate hall. That silence had been shock. This one was something colder. "To what end?" the officer asked. Voskareth looked out at the empty colony, functional, sustained, maintained in their absence like a home left by people who intended to return, and thought about item 12 on the list. The inoculation protocols for Vendari plague, strain 7 and strain 9. A strain that the Compact's medical division had classified as extinct 8 years ago, a classification that the humans, apparently, had not agreed with. "I don't know yet," Voskareth said honestly, "but I think we need to go to Kessel Station." What Kessel Station contained required 19 days to review in full. It was a repository of recordings, as the document had stated. 411 separate recordings, ranging from 43 seconds to 7 hours in length. They were indexed by the same mathematical notation system as the 7th page of the document, which meant that by the time the analysis team reached Kessel Station, they had a working translation guide and could watch them in the sequence the humans had specified. The first recordings were observational, deep space survey footage, mostly, the kind of data gathering that every species in the Compact conducted as standard practice. They showed the outer rim. They showed the stellar boundary. They showed the biological transmission vector, classified by the Compact as inactive, pulsing with an activity level that the Compact's sensors had not detected because the sensors were calibrated to the wrong frequency range. A calibration decision made 30 years ago by a Compact science committee, based on modeling assumptions that had seemed sound at the time. The humans had known about the miscalibration for 22 years. They had documented it in the recordings without reporting it to the Compact. "Why?" Mara Salek asked, standing in the Kessel Station review room on day 7. "Why watch us miss it and say nothing?" "Keep watching," Voskareth said, because by day 7 Voskareth had begun to understand that the sequence was the point, and that arriving at conclusions before the sequence was complete was a habit the humans had specifically anticipated and specifically designed the repository to disrupt. On day 11, the recordings shifted. The stellar boundary footage was joined by footage of something else, a species, not previously cataloged by the compact, observed at extreme range in the outer rim. Not a new discovery in the sense that discovery implied surprise. The footage timestamps indicated the humans had first documented this species 31 years ago. 31 years of recordings, of observation, of a species moving, spreading, following a pattern that the compact's models would have classified. Voskareth realized with a particular sensation that had no adequate name, as asterisk logistically purposeless. Except that it wasn't. The pattern, when the full 31 years of footage were assembled and the mathematical notation system was applied as an overlay, was a precise and patient approach. Not toward human space, not toward the nearest compact worlds, toward the biological transmission vector that the compact had classified as inactive, toward the communication relay vulnerability that the compact had not known existed, toward the stellar boundary that, in approximately 37 years and 4 months, would destabilize in a way that would amplify the transmission vector's reach to encompass approximately 60% of compact inhabited space. The three phenomena were not independent. They had never been independent. The species in the outer rim had been cultivating the interaction between them for 3 decades. They found them 31 years ago, Fenaro said, on day 14, voice carrying a quality that Voskareth had never heard in 20 years of professional collaboration. The humans found them 31 years ago, and they have been. Watching, Voskareth said, documenting, preparing. While you were afraid of us, said a voice from the doorway. Yara Chen stood at the entrance to the Kessel Station review room. She was wearing clothes that looked slept-in, and she looked like someone who had been traveling for a long time. She had arrived without announcement, which should have been impossible given Kessel Station's security protocols, and which was somehow less surprising than it should have been. Fenaro stared. Ambassador, the resolution is a document, Chen said. Documents don't follow people. She walked into the room and looked at the display, at the 31 years of footage assembled into a picture of something patient and terrible moving through the outer rim. Her expression was the expression of someone who has carried information alone for a long time and is finally in a room with people who can see what they've been carrying. You've gotten to day 14, she said. Keep going. Day 17 is when you'll understand what we need. What you need, Fenaro said carefully, or what the compact needs. Chen looked at Fenaros for a long moment. By day 17, she said, you won't be able to tell the difference. Day 17 showed the contact event. It was not footage of a battle. It was footage of a negotiation, or what would have been a negotiation if the outer rim species communicated in a way that permitted it. What it showed instead was a human vessel, approaching the outer rim entity's territory in a configuration that the compact's analysis team recognized, after 12 minutes of review, as specifically designed to appear non-threatening. Every element of the vessel's approach trajectory, its communications emissions, its visual profile as presented to the entity's sensors, all of it had been crafted to minimize threat signaling. The entity had responded by destroying the vessel. Not because of anything the crew had done, not as a response to any specific provocation. The compact's analysts watched the destruction 3 times from 3 different camera angles, from 3 different sensor arrays that the humans had positioned in the region in advance, and reached the same conclusion each time. The entity had destroyed the vessel because the vessel was there, and anything in the entity's space was destroyed. It was not malice. It was not strategy. It was appetite. The crew had known this was the probable outcome. The recording included pre-approach audio from inside the vessel. The crew, 11 humans, had made recordings of themselves before the final approach. Not final messages to family, though those were present. Something additional. Each crew member had made a separate recording, short and specific, of what they had observed about the entity over the course of their mission. Technical observations. behavioral data, the specific frequencies the entity used to detect vessels, the specific configurations it did not respond to or responded to more slowly. 11 people, recording technical data in the hour before they died, because the data was more useful to what came after them than anything else they could leave behind. They volunteered, Mara Salik said. It was not a question. The document we sent the Senate, Chen said from behind them. She had remained in the room, watching the analysis team watch the recordings. Item 9. Voskareth pulled up the document. Item 9 read, the vessels you could not account for were not performing logistically purposeless maneuvers. They were gathering terminal data on the convergence threat. The crews understood the probability of return. The probability of return. Voskareth turned to face Chen. How many vessels? 47, she said, over the past 6 years. The number sat in the room and changed the weight of the air. 47 vessels, over 6 years, sent into territory that destroyed anything that entered it to gather the data that would make a defense possible. And the humans had told no one, because telling the compact would have required explaining what they had found, and explaining what they had found would have required explaining how long they had known, and explaining that would have required answering the question of why they had not reported it through official channels 31 years ago when they first identified the threat. The answer to that question Voskareth already knew without being told. They had not reported it because they had known 31 years ago what the compact's response would be. They had known the compact would be afraid. You spent 31 years preparing to solve a problem, Voskareth said, that you never told us you had found because you knew we would interfere with the solution. Chen didn't answer immediately. She walked to the display, to the frozen image of the outer rim, and stood with her hands at her sides with the posture of someone who has stopped performing for an audience. We ran the models, she said finally. With compact involvement from year one, every model, the outcome was the same. The compact investigates, debates, forms committees, requires consensus from 1,400 member species on a crisis that requires a response architecture that consensus prevents. She paused. Not because you're corrupt, not because you're cowards. Because the compact was built by species that solved problems by talking about them. And this is a problem that can only be solved by a species willing to send 47 ships into a thing that will definitely destroy them. And that species, Fenaro said, with something that was not quite bitterness, is you. We weren't sure, Chen said, but we were willing to find out. The defense architecture the humans had designed required the compact's infrastructure. All of it, the relay network, the boundary monitoring stations, the biological containment grid that the compact had built for a different threat 40 years ago and never dismantled because dismantling things required committee approval. The humans had designed a solution that they could not execute alone, using resources they did not have, that required the cooperation of a civilization that had just voted to eradicate them. Which was, Voskareth understood slowly, sitting in the review room on day 19 with the full picture finally assembled, the point. They had not maneuvered the compact into the extinction vote out of anger. They had not done it as leverage. They had done it because the extinction vote was the only mechanism in the compact's legal structure that allowed one species to address another species' government directly, without committee process, without multi-species consensus delay, without the 17 layers of procedural review that the compact's normal diplomatic channels required. Resolution 7 Omega was not a death sentence. It was an appointment. They needed us to try to kill them, Mara Salik said, and her voice had the quality of someone saying words that don't belong in the same sentence, watching them cohere anyway. They needed us to see them, Voskareth corrected, clearly, without the distance of normal procedure. The vote forced a direct confrontation, and direct confrontation forced us to listen. A pause, and they needed 30 days. The grace period, Fenaro said. The documentation window, 30 days where under compact law, we were required to observe them and record their behavior. 30 days of us watching every move they made. 47 dead crews worth of data delivered through official channels with compact authentication because it came in during the legal observation period of an extinction protocol. Voskerath looked at Chen. That's why the document was addressed to us specifically. You needed the Xenological Division's analytical resources applied to this data under legal compulsion. Chen was quiet for a moment. Then, you would have read it anyway. But we would have had the option to deprioritize, to debate, to refer upward. Voskerath paused. You removed our options. We removed your delay, she said. There's a difference. The retrofit of the compact's relay network took 18 months. Humans worked alongside compact engineers in shifts that the humans extended past the standard working period because, as the lead human technical team explained to their compact counterparts with complete sincerity, the timeline didn't accommodate standard working periods. The Compact Engineers Union filed 14 complaints. The humans brought food to the meetings where the complaints were reviewed, which violated 6 protocols and apparently resolved the emotional temperature of 4 of the 14 complaints in ways that the Compact's procedural guidelines had no framework for. Voskerath observed all of this from the monitoring station and wrote nothing in the official record that could be classified as sentiment, and wrote extensive notes in the private journal that had been accumulating for 11 years. The Outer Rim entity moved on schedule. It moved toward the convergence point, toward the stellar boundary, the transmission vector, the relay network's structural vulnerability, with the patient certainty of something that had never encountered resistance that mattered. It had crossed 11 star systems in 31 years. It would cross the final approach in 6 months. The humans were ready in 5.5. It won't be clean, Chen told Voskerath, in the command center of the defense grid 48 hours before the entity's projected arrival. The outer relay stations will absorb the initial pressure. We'll lose them. How many personnel are stationed at the outer relays? We evacuated as many as the timeline allowed. She said it flatly. Voskerath had learned enough in 19 months of working alongside humans to hear what flatness meant in their voices. Not all. How many remained? She looked at her hands, the same gesture as the Senate chamber, checking something, confirming. Enough to maintain the grid activation sequence manually if the automated systems fail, she said, which our models say they will, in the first 11 minutes. The outer relay stations held 43 compact personnel, and Voskerath discovered from the manifest filed 4 days earlier in the logistics system, 106 humans who had, apparently, been at the stations for the past 6 weeks under engineering authorization codes that technically permitted their presence, and had not been cross-checked against the personnel roster until Voskerath was looking at them in this moment. 106 humans, stationed voluntarily at the points most likely to fail first, to manually maintain a grid that would save a civilization that had voted to destroy them. Voskerath looked at Chen. There was a question that the analytical mind assembled and then held, because the question was too large for the moment, and also because the answer was already present in the room, in the person standing next to the display with her hands at her sides, with the posture of someone who had already answered every question they could find and accepted the ones they couldn't. Why? Voskerath asked anyway. Chen was quiet for 3 seconds. Outside the command center, the grid was running. Somewhere in the outer dark, 106 humans were sitting at their stations. Because it needed doing, she said, and because we were the only ones who'd already decided the cost was acceptable. She paused. We decided that 31 years ago. We've just been finishing the math. The entity arrived at 400, station time. It was larger than the models had predicted. This was noted calmly in the logs by the automated systems, and then the automated systems failed. And what came after was 11 minutes of manual operation by people at stations that were, in the specific and measured language of the post-event technical report, exposed to irrecoverable structural compromise. The grid held. The entity, for the first time in 31 years of observation, encountered something that pushed back. The convergence point was blocked. The stellar boundary held its geometry. The transmission vector went inert when the relay network, repaired and recalibrated to human specifications over 18 months, redirected the frequencies the entity used as a carrier signal into a cancellation, pattern so precise that the post-event analysis team would spend 3 years confirming it had been intentional. It had been intentional. It had been designed by 47 dead crews and 106 people who had volunteered for exposed stations, to be so precise that there was no margin in it, no redundancy, no safety threshold. The humans had built the defense with the resources exactly required, no more, because every resource above exact requirement was a resource spent on the wrong thing when the right thing needed all of it. Losses, Commander Orithval asked. The communications officer looked at the manifest, back at the commander, back at the manifest. Outer relay stations 3, 7, and 11, all personnel, a pause. That's our count. Human personnel on those stations, the humans are reporting their own losses separately. How many? 61. The command center was quiet. Voskareth sat at the monitoring station and thought about the laugh in the Senate chamber, about the hands, about item 17. We know you will not believe this list is real. We wrote it anyway. 61 people who had known, with reasonable certainty, that they were volunteering for stations that would not survive, because the stations needed to be maintained by someone who had already decided the cost was acceptable. They had decided 31 years ago. They had been finishing the math. The Galactic Senate convened an emergency session 6 weeks after the defense event. The agenda item, formally titled Asterisk Reconsideration of Resolution 7 Omega in light of new information, was debated for 19 hours. Multiple delegates argued that the resolution remained technically valid under its original terms. Multiple others argued that the original terms had been applied to an incomplete understanding of the species being condemned. The debate was precise and procedurally correct, and Voskareth thought, watching from the analyst's gallery, beside the point in a way that the Senate floor had no mechanism for acknowledging. Yara Chen was not present for the session. She had returned to wherever the humans had gone, to whatever place they had prepared during their 31 days of grace period. The resolution's reconsideration did not require her presence. She had not come to watch. Voskareth thought about that, about a species that had spent 31 years designing a solution, executed it, paid for it, and then did not come to observe the meeting where the people they had saved decided whether to officially stop trying to kill them. The resolution was formally suspended, pending comprehensive review, by a vote of 1,198 to 503. Not unanimous. 503 delegates still voted to sustain it. Voskareth wrote in the private journal that night, "They are afraid of the humans because the humans solved a 31-year problem that the Compact didn't know existed, using methods the Compact can't replicate, at a cost the Compact can't process. They are afraid because the humans are not comprehensible. They are afraid because the humans are not impressed by the fear. I have spent 11 years studying humans. Here is what I know. They are not the most powerful species. They are not the most intelligent. They are not the most technologically sophisticated. They are, by every standard metric we have, a middling civilization, young, geographically limited, biologically vulnerable. They are the only civilization in the Compact that spent 31 years building a solution to a problem, while the civilization they were building it for tried, repeatedly, to eradicate them. They are the only civilization that wrote, "We know you will not believe this," and wrote it anyway. The compact will not know what to do with this. We will debate it. We will form committees. We will write procedural frameworks for how to categorize a species that does not fit any existing category. The humans will be somewhere else by then, watching something we haven't noticed yet, running models with a patience we don't have the architecture to understand, and writing, for some future analysis team that hasn't been formed yet, the first page of a list that begins, "We know you will not believe this." I believe them. That is the most frightening thing I have written in 11 years. Voskareth received one final communication from Chen, transmitted from an origin point that the compact's tracking systems logged and then, somehow, lost before the coordinates could be confirmed. It was short. "We watched your debate. We appreciated the 1198. We're not worried about the 503. Fear is a reasonable response to something you don't understand yet. We understand. We've been there. There's a phenomenon in the velar cluster that we've been monitoring for 6 years. You should probably start looking at it. The access code to the relevant repository is the same as before. First contact, your calendar." Don't read the last page first. YC. PS. The inoculation protocols. Strain 9 has activated in the biological transmission vector. You have approximately 14 months before it's detectable by standard sensors. The protocols are already in the medical repository. Sublevel 4. The access code works. You're welcome. Voskareth read the message 4 times, in the quiet of the monitoring station, with the stellar boundary data from the outer rim running on the display in the background, stable now, held in geometry by something that had cost 61 lives and 31 years of work done in silence. Then Voskareth opened a new file in the private journal and began writing. The first entry in what would become a 47-year record of phenomena observed but not yet understood, maintained in the specific and patient style of someone who had learned, from a species that had no business surviving in a galaxy this large and this dangerous, that the meaning was in the sequence. That it was worth writing down, even when no one would believe it. That you finished the math. Even when the math cost